Welcome to a definitive forensic reconstruction of the most infamous unsolved double homicide in American history. Today, we are stripping away the folklore, the nursery rhymes, and the century of speculation. We are going back to August 4th, 1892, to walk the timeline minute by minute. We will analyze the digestion rates, the blood spatter patterns, and the rigid social architecture of the Borden household, to understand not just who committed these crimes, but how the window of opportunity opened and closed with such devastating precision. This is the timeline of the Borden murders. At 6:15 a.m., the heat was already oppressive. Bridget Sullivan, the Borden family's 26-year-old Irish maid, stood before the cast-iron stove in the kitchen, coaxing a coal fire to life. The air inside the house at 92 2nd Street was stagnant. The windows had been shut tight all night, a security measure insisted upon by the master of the house, Andrew Borden. Bridget felt ill. Her stomach churned, a lingering symptom of the sickness that had plagued the entire household for days. She moved with a heavy, mechanical lethargy, her hands blackened by coal dust as she fed the hopper. The fire caught, but it brought no comfort, only raising the temperature in the small, cramped scullery. She filled the kettle. Her orders were specific: breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp. Upstairs, the house stirred. Andrew Borden, 70 years old and worth nearly $500,000 in modern currency, descended the back stairs, wearing a heavy cardigan despite the August humidity. He carried a slop pail from the bedroom, a daily ritual of frugality and self-reliance that bypassed the need for indoor plumbing on the upper floors. He emptied it in the cellar, washed his hands, and moved to the sitting room. He was a man of rigid habits. He checked the locks on the front door. He checked the bolts on the side door. The house was a fortress, not to keep people in, but to keep the world and its expenses out. Abby Borden, his wife of 27 years, followed him down shortly after. She was short, stout, and moved with the heavy breath of a woman who found the heat particularly punishing. She began to set the table in the dining room. There was no conversation between the maid and the mistress beyond necessary instruction. The silence in the house was dense, built on years of accumulated resentments. Breakfast was served at 7 a.m. It was a grim culinary affair. Bridget placed the platter on the table, mutton broth and warmed-over mutton from a joint served days prior, accompanied by johnny cakes, molasses, and coffee. The mutton was grey and tough. This meal would become a critical piece of forensic evidence. The rate at which Andrew and Abby Borden digested this specific, fibrous meat would later allow medical examiners to pinpoint their times of death with a margin of error that contradicted the accused's testimony. They ate quickly. Andrew picked at the mutton. He too had been sick, suspecting poison in the milk, though the local doctor dismissed it as summer heat affecting the food supply. Abby ate more heartily than her husband. Lizzie Borden did not appear. At 7:15 a.m., a key interaction occurred. A young man arrived at the back door, John Morse, Andrew's brother-in-law from his first marriage, who had stayed the night. Andrew and John spoke briefly in the sitting room. The conversation was about business, specifically property transfers and farm leases in Swansea. This talk of property was the fault line running beneath the floorboards of the Borden house. It was the source of the strained relations Lizzie would later allude to. At 7:45 a.m., the breakfast concluded. Bridget began clearing the plates. Andrew Borden moved to the sitting room to read the Providence Journal. Abby Borden began her morning dusting. The house was quiet again, save for the clatter of china in the sink. Around 8 a.m., the first departure took place. John Morse left the house to visit relatives on the other side of town. Andrew let him out, locking and bolting the door behind him immediately. The lock was a heavy spring latch, requiring a key from the outside and a thumb turn from the inside. At 8:45 a.m., John Morse was gone. Andrew Borden prepared to leave for his morning business rounds. He exchanged his cardigan for a Prince Albert coat, putting on a hat, but leaving his vest unbuttoned due to the heat. As Andrew moved toward the side door, Abby stood by the dining room table. She had a specific task in mind. She informed Bridget that she was going upstairs to clean the guest room where John Morse had slept. She needed to change the pillow slips. "I will be upstairs," Abby said. It was a statement of location that placed her in the geographical trap of the second floor. Andrew Borden stepped out into the crushing heat of 2nd Street at exactly 9 a.m. Bridget Sullivan locked the door behind him. She shot the bolt. She turned the key. The house was now sealed. Inside, 3 women remained. Bridget Sullivan in the kitchen, Abby Borden moving up the front stairs, and Lizzie Borden, who finally came downstairs moments after her father left. Lizzie's movements between 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. are a study in contradiction. She entered the kitchen. She spoke to Bridget. Her voice was calm, devoid of the sickness that plagued the others. She refused the mutton. She took a cup of coffee, and according to Bridget, mentioned she might go to the barn to find lead sinkers for a fishing trip. Lizzie was wearing a dress of light blue bengaline silk, or perhaps a cotton wrapper. Witness descriptions would later vary, creating a fog of doubt. What is certain is that the dress she wore at 9 a.m. showed no signs of blood. At 9:15 a.m., Bridget Sullivan received her orders. Abby Borden, before ascending the stairs, had instructed her to wash the windows, both inside and out. It was a massive task for a sick woman in 90-degree heat. Bridget gathered her pail and brushes. "I'm going outside to do the windows now," Bridget told Lizzie. "You needn't lock the door," Lizzie replied. "I will be around." Bridget stepped out the side door. She began washing the exterior windows of the sitting room. She was now separated from the interior of the house. Inside, Abby Borden reached the landing of the 2nd floor. The guest room was at the front of the house, directly over the sitting room. It was a large room, sparsely furnished, with a bed tucked into the corner between the door and the window. Abby entered. She carried fresh pillowcases. She moved to the bed, removed the used slips, and threw them on the floor. She bent over the bed to smooth the sheets. She was facing the wall. Her back was to the door. The timeline suggests it was now approximately 9:30 a.m. Someone entered the room behind her. The floorboards in the hall were known to creak, yet there is no evidence Abby turned around. This suggests the intruder was someone she knew, someone whose footsteps did not signal danger. The weapon was a hatchet, likely one with a handle that had been broken or deliberately removed to conceal blood in the wood grain. The first blow struck Abby just above the ear. It was an incapacitating strike. She fell forward, her face hitting the floor between the bed and a dressing bureau. The attacker did not stop. Straddling the prone body of the 64-year-old woman, the killer delivered 18 more blows to the back of her head. The violence was frenzied yet mechanically efficient. There was no scream. The heavy woolen carpet absorbed the sound of the fall. The thick walls and closed windows sealed the noise within the guest room. Downstairs, perhaps 20 feet away through the floorboards, the house remained silent. Outside, Bridget Sullivan dipped her brush into a pail of water, unaware that the mistress of the house was dead. The timeline now enters a critical cool-down phase. From 9:30 a.m. to 10:40 a.m., the house held a corpse on the 2nd floor, while life continued on the ground floor and in the street. Andrew Borden was seen by several citizens of Fall River. He went to the Union Savings Bank. He went to the National Union Bank. He stopped at a shop to converse. He was a man conducting business as usual, unaware that his timeline had been severed. He was walking toward his own death. Back at 92 2nd Street, Bridget Sullivan finished the outside windows. She felt dizzy. She came back inside, latching the screen door, but finding the heavy wooden door unlocked. She moved to the kitchen to wash the inside of the windows. Lizzie Borden was in the kitchen. She was ironing handkerchiefs. She appeared calm. She asked Bridget if she was planning to go out to a department store sale. Bridget said no, she was too ill. "I think I shall go upstairs and lie down," Bridget said. "Do," Lizzie replied. At 10:40 a.m., Andrew Borden returned. He walked up the path to the side door. He tried to open it. It was locked. Not just latched, but bolted from the inside. This was unusual. He had his key, but the bolt held fast. He knocked. Bridget Sullivan, who had not yet gone upstairs, heard the knock. She rushed to the door. She fumbled with the locks, her fingers sticky with cleaning water. The mechanism jammed. She uttered a mild curse of frustration. From the top of the stairs, a sound drifted down. It was a laugh, a soft, short laugh. Bridget looked up. Lizzie Borden was standing on the landing of the second floor. From her vantage point, Lizzie could see the door to the guest room, where Abby's body lay in a pool of coagulating blood. Lizzie did not mention her stepmother. She did not mention the body. She stood between the dead woman and the living father. "Father is here," Lizzie said. The door finally opened. Andrew Borden stepped into the cool hallway. He was tired. The heat had exhausted him. He held a small parcel in his hand. "Where is Mrs. Borden?" Andrew asked. It was the question that would define the rest of the morning. "She had a note from someone who is sick," Lizzie answered. "She has gone out." This was a lie. There was no note. Abby Borden was less than 30 feet away, her blood beginning to tack and dry on the guest room floor. Andrew accepted the explanation. He walked into the dining room. He sat in a rocking chair. Lizzie came to him. She asked if he wanted the window blinds closed to keep the room cool. He agreed. She attended to him with the solicitude of a dutiful daughter. She suggested he lie down on the sofa in the sitting room for a nap. "I think I will," he said. Andrew moved to the sitting room, the room directly beneath the body of his wife. He removed his boots. He placed a shawl over the arm of the sofa to protect the upholstery. He lay down, resting his head on the armrest, his feet touching the floor. He was vulnerable. His eyes closed. It was 10:55 a.m. Bridget Sullivan finished her work in the kitchen. "I am going upstairs to my room," she called out. "Very well," Lizzie said. Bridget climbed the back stairs to her attic room on the 3rd floor. She lay on her bed, exhausted, and closed her eyes. The heat rose to the top of the house, heavy and suffocating. The house was quiet again. Andrew Borden dozed. His digestion was processing the mutton from 3 hours ago. Between 11 a.m. and 11:10 a.m., the timeline narrows to a singularity. The killer entered the sitting room. Andrew Borden did not wake. He did not raise a hand in defense. The first blow with the hatchet struck him in the face, splitting his eye and nose. He was unconscious instantly. The attacker struck 10 more times. The blows were focused on the face and head. Blood sprayed onto the wall, onto the framed artwork, and in a fine mist over the sofa. But notably, very little blood would have landed on the attacker due to the angle of the strikes and the position of the victim. Andrew Borden's watch stopped. His life ended. The house sat in silence for approximately 5 minutes. At 11:15 a.m., the silence was broken. Bridget Sullivan was drifting into sleep in the attic when a voice cut through the floorboards. It was Lizzie. She was standing at the foot of the back stairs, shouting up. There was no hysteria in the voice, but there was urgency. "Maggie, come down!" Bridget used the name Maggie as a nickname. She sat up, confused. "What is the matter?" Bridget called back. "Come down quick! Father's dead! Someone has come in and killed him!" Bridget scrambled off the bed. She ran down the back stairs. She reached the kitchen. Lizzie was standing near the screen door. She was not crying. She was not hysterical. She was standing very still. "Don't go in there," Lizzie said, gesturing toward the sitting room. "I've got to have a doctor. Go for Dr. Bowen." Bridget ran out of the house. She ran across the street to the doctor's residence. Lizzie Borden remained alone in the house with 2 bodies. One she had acknowledged, one she had not. Bridget returned with a neighbour, Mrs. Churchill, as the doctor was not home. They entered the side door. They saw Lizzie. Mrs. Churchill asked. Lizzie said. Mrs. Churchill moved past the kitchen, peering into the sitting room. The sight that greeted her was grotesque. Andrew Borden lay on the sofa, his face a ruin of bone and blood. The wounds were fresh. The blood was still bright red and dripping. The forensic timeline had reached its terminus. The window of opportunity was closed. There was no stranger seen leaving the yard. The doors were locked. The timeline allowed for no external intruder to enter, kill, and vanish without a trace in the 10 minutes Bridget was upstairs. Andrew Borden was dead. The police would soon arrive, and the first question they would ask, the question that would echo for 100 years, was simple. Where was the blood on Lizzie's dress? It was a puzzle of physics and fluid dynamics that defied immediate explanation. Lizzie stood in the doorframe, clad in a blue dress of Bengaline silk, or perhaps it was a Bedford cord. The memory of witnesses would fray and diverge on this specific detail, creating a kaleidoscope of contradictory testimony in the weeks to come. But in that moment, she appeared pristine. There was no smear of red on her hem, no splatter on her bodice, no telltale spray upon her hair. If she had swung a hatchet with enough force to cleave a skull, logic dictated she should be bathed in the evidence of her exertion. Yet, she was as composed and clean as a porcelain doll placed on a shelf, untouched by the carnage mere feet away. Dr. Bowen arrived, breathless and pale. He pushed past the women, his medical bag clutching tight in his hand, and entered the sitting room. He was a man accustomed to death, to the slow fading of consumption and the sudden stops of cardiac failure. But nothing in his practice had prepared him for the butchery of Andrew Borden. He approached the sofa. The smell was already rising, the copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the heavy, humid air of the closed-up house. He lifted Andrew's wrist. There was no pulse. The hand was still warm, the skin pliable. The blood on the floor was bright crimson, pooling and soaking into the carpet, not yet congealed. This was a death measured in minutes, not hours. Bowen looked at the face, or what remained of it, and felt a wave of nausea. The eye had been bisected. The nose was severed. The skull was a map of fractures. He stepped back, wiping his brow with a handkerchief that trembled in his grip. Bowen announced unnecessarily to the women gathered in the kitchen. Lizzie had sunk into a chair in the kitchen. She was fanning herself, her face flushed but her eyes dry. She said, her voice small. Mrs. Churchill asked suddenly, a cold realization dawning on her. If an intruder had come in to kill the master of the house, surely the mistress would have heard the commotion. Lizzie looked up, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Churchill said, looking at Bridget. The maid was terrified, her eyes wide, shrinking against the wall. She did not want to move. She did not want to see. Bridget shook her head, but Mrs. Churchill took her arm, guiding her toward the front hallway. They bypassed the sitting room, averting their eyes from the horror on the sofa, and ascended the front stairs. The house was stiflingly hot. The air in the upper hallway hung heavy and still, trapped between the closed windows and the baking roof. As they reached the landing, Mrs. Churchill looked toward the guest room door, which stood open. From her vantage point on the stairs, her line of sight cut across the floor of the room, under the heavy wooden bed frame. She stopped. Her grip on Bridget's arm tightened until it bruised. She whispered. Visible through the gap between the bed rails and the floor was a shape, a mound. It was the curve of a woman's back, clad in a house dress. Mrs. Churchill did not scream. The shock had moved beyond hysteria into a strange, numbing clarity. She walked forward, stepping into the guest room. She looked over the foot of the bed. Abby Borden lay face down on the floor, her body wedged between the bed and the dressing bureau. Her head was surrounded by a dark, coagulated halo. Unlike Andrew, whose blood was bright and flowing, Abby's blood was dark, thick and brown. It had matted her grey hair and soaked into the carpet in a dry, crusty stain. Mrs. Churchill backed away, her hands covering her mouth. She choked out. Downstairs, the news hit with the force of a physical blow. Lizzie did not seem surprised. She did not ask how. She simply said, quote, "The timeline was fracturing. Andrew was warm, Abby was cold. Andrew bled red, Abby bled brown. The intruder, this phantom assassin, would have had to enter the house, kill Abby, wait in the silence of the home for 90 minutes while Bridget washed windows and Lizzie ironed handkerchiefs, and then kill Andrew before vanishing into thin air. By 11:35 a.m., the police began to arrive. Officer George Allen was the first on the scene, running from the station merely 400 yards away. He was winded, his uniform heavy with sweat. He saw the crowd gathering on 2nd Street, neighbours, passers-by, mill workers on break, drawn by the psychic magnetism of disaster. The rumour had spread with telegraphic speed. Something happened at the Borden house. Alan entered the side door and was met by Dr. Bowen. The doctor led him to the sitting room. Alan, a hardened man of the beat, felt his knees weaken. He tasked a neighbour to guard the door and ran back to the station to alert Marshal Hilliard. Within the hour, the house was swarming. City Marshal Hilliard, medical examiner Dr. Dolan, and a gaggle of patrolmen descended upon 92 2nd Street. The investigation that followed was a chaotic collision of 19th-century police work and the complexities of a sealed-room mystery. They moved through the rooms like bulls in a china shop. They touched the doors, they walked through the blood, they handled the bodies. There was no crime scene tape, no fingerprint powder, no DNA swabs. There was only observation and deduction. And they observed Lizzie. She was the centre of the storm, yet she remained oddly detached. She had changed her dress, slipping into a pink wrapper. She lay on the lounge in the dining room while the police examined her father's body, just feet away in the sitting room. Officer Harrington asked, notebook in hand. Lizzie replied. Harrington pressed. The heat in the barn would have been suffocating, easily over 100 degrees in the unventilated loft. Harrington signalled for another officer. They went out the back door to the barn. The sun was at its zenith, beating down on the yard. The pear trees were heavy with fruit, rotting on the ground, attracting swarms of flies. They entered the barn. It was an oven. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old hay. They climbed the stairs to the loft. The floorboards were covered in a thick, uniform layer of dust. The sunlight streaming through the cracks in the walls illuminated the floating particles. Harrington looked at the floor. He looked at his own boots, leaving clear, dark impressions in the grey dust. Then he looked around the loft. There were no footprints. Aside from their own fresh marks, the floor was undisturbed. If Lizzie Borden had walked up here 20 minutes ago, paced around looking for lead, and stood eating a pear, she had done so without touching the ground. The alibi was dissolving before it had even been fully recorded. Back inside, the medical examiner was making a gruesome determination. He ordered the bodies to be moved. The dining room table, the same table where the family had eaten their mutton broth and johnny cakes hours earlier, was cleared. A rubber sheet was laid down. The autopsies would happen here, in the house. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd outside swelled to the hundreds. They pressed against the fence, peering at the windows. The Borden house, always a fortress of privacy, had become a public theatre. Inside, the sound of the saw rasping against bone echoed from the dining room as Dr. Dolan removed the victims' skulls for evidence. Lizzie remained upstairs now, attended by Alice Russell, a friend who had come to support her. The police were searching her room. They opened her closet. They sifted through her drawers. They found no bloody clothes. They found no hatchet. In the cellar, however, they found something curious. In a box on a shelf near the furnace, buried under old tools, was a hatchet head. It was detached from its handle. The break was fresh. The wood remaining in the eye of the blade was white and new. The blade itself was covered in ashes, as if it had been rolled in a coal pit to coat it. "Look at this," Officer Fleet said, holding it up. "No handle? Why break the handle off a hatchet?" "Maybe because the handle was covered in blood," his partner suggested. "Easier to burn a piece of wood than to wash it." They wrapped the head in paper. It was circumstantial, weak, but it was the only weapon they had. The sun set, but the heat did not break. The bodies were finally moved to the undertaking rooms. The house fell into a new kind of silence, not the empty silence of the morning, but a watchful, suspicious silence. Bridget Sullivan spent the night in the attic, terrified that the killer was still within the walls. Lizzie Borden slept in her room, the door locked. The days that followed were a blur of ritual and interrogation. The funeral was held on Saturday. Andrew and Abby were buried, their heads, secretly missing, stored in the jars of Dr. Dolan for further study. On Sunday, the incident occurred. Alice Russell came into the kitchen to find Lizzie standing by the stove. Lizzie held a dress, a blue Bedford cord dress. She was feeding it into the fire. "Lizzie, what are you doing?" Alice asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Lizzie turned, her face calm. I am burning this old thing. It is covered in paint. I brushed against the wall. Alice stepped forward, horrified. She knew the police were looking for a dress. She knew the suspicion that was whispering through the town. You shouldn't let anyone see you do that, Lizzie. That is the worst thing you could do. Lizzie poked the fabric with a stove iron, watching the blue material turn to black ash. It is of no consequence, she said. It is ruined. But it was of consequence. It was the spark that ignited the prosecution. The inquest began in a small, stifling room above the police station. Lizzie was subpoenaed to testify. She was not allowed counsel. She stood alone before the district attorney, Hosea Knowlton. Knowlton was a sharp, aggressive man, and he sensed blood. He did not treat her as a grieving daughter. He treated her as a hostile witness. "Miss Borden," he began, "where were you when your father was killed?" "I was in the barn." "And before that?" "I was in the kitchen." "And before that?" "I was upstairs." Her answers were a labyrinth of contradictions. One moment she was ironing, the next she was sewing. One moment she saw her father take a nap, the next she didn't. She claimed to have heard nothing, no screams, no thuds, no sound of a 200-pound man falling to the floor, despite being mere yards away. She was likely under the influence of morphine, prescribed by Dr. Bowen to calm her nerves, but to the jury, her confusion looked like deception. Her lack of emotion looked like coldness. On August 11th, 1 week after the murders, Marshal Hilliard arrived at the Borden house with a warrant. Lizzie was sitting in the parlour, he intoned. She did not cry. She stood up, smoothed her skirts and said, she was taken to the Taunton jail. The news flashed across the country. Daughter arrested. Parricide in Fall River. The Victorian world was shaken to its foundations. It was inconceivable that a woman, a church-going, upper-middle-class spinster, could commit such an act of savage violence. Women were considered incapable of such brutality. It went against the very nature of their gender, or so the sociologists and theologians of the time argued. The trial, held in New Bedford the following June, became the first true media circus of the American judicial system. Reporters from New York, Boston, and even London flocked to the courthouse. They described Lizzie's attire, her demeanour, her hands, her fans. The prosecution, led by Knowlton, laid out a timeline that was tight as a drum. They argued that Lizzie had a motive, greed and hatred of her stepmother. They argued she had the opportunity. She was the only one alone with the victims. They argued she had the means, the handleless hatchet which fit the wounds perfectly. They brought out the skulls. In a moment of theatrical horror that caused women in the gallery to faint, Dr. Dolan unveiled the bleached skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden. He walked to the jury box, the handleless hatchet in his hand, and demonstrated how the blade fit into the clefts in the bone. Chunk, chunk. The sound of metal on bone echoed in the silent courtroom. Lizzie, seeing her father's skull, slid to the floor in a dead faint. It was the first show of genuine emotion she had displayed. But the defense, led by the brilliant George Robinson, former governor of Massachusetts, had a different narrative. Robinson understood the jury. He knew they were 12 middle-aged men, fathers and husbands. He knew they could not reconcile the image of their own daughters with the image of a hatchet-wielding maniac. Robinson systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. "Where is the blood?" he thundered. "You say she struck Mrs. Borden 19 times? You say she struck Mr. Borden 11 times? That is 30 blows. Blood would have been everywhere. It would have been in her hair, in her eyes, in the fibres of her dress. And yet, the police found nothing. Not one spot, not one drop." He dismissed the burning of the dress. "A woman is entitled to dispose of soiled clothing," he argued. "Are we to hang a woman because she is tidy?" He attacked the timeline. "Is it possible," he asked, "that a madman, a stranger, lay in wait, slipped in while Bridget was washing the windows, hid in the closet, struck and fled?" But the masterstroke was the exclusion of the inquest testimony. The judges ruled that Lizzie's confused, contradictory statements made to Knowlton immediately after the murders were inadmissible because she had not been read her rights and had been under the influence of morphine. Without her own words to tangle her, The prosecution was left with only circumstantial evidence. The trial lasted 13 days. The heat in the courtroom was oppressive. The jury, tired and sweltering, retired to deliberate. They were gone for only 1 hour. When they returned, the foreman stood up. The courtroom held its breath. Lizzie Borden stood, gripping the rail of the dock. Not guilty. The room erupted. Cheers rang out. Men threw their hats in the air. Lizzie collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. She was free. But the verdict of the court was not the verdict of the community. Lizzie returned to Fall River, but she did not return to her old life. She inherited her father's fortune, buying a grand house on the hill which she named Maplecroft. She bought the carriages, the clothes, and the theatre tickets she had always craved. But Fall River turned its back. Her friends from the church stopped calling. The neighbours crossed the street to avoid her. She became a ghost in her own town. The children of Fall River, sensing the darkness that the adults refused to speak of, began to skip rope to a new rhyme. It started in the schoolyards and spread to the streets, a cruel, sing-song indictment that would outlive the facts of the case. Lizzie Borden took an axe, but the story did not end with the rhyme. The mystery deepened with the years. What truly happened in those 90 minutes? If one looks closely at the timeline, the impossible becomes possible through the lens of cold calculation. Return to the morning of August 4th. Abby goes upstairs to clean the guest room around 9:30 a.m. Lizzie follows. She knows Bridget is outside washing windows. The house is loud with the sound of the pail and the brush. Lizzie confronts Abby. Perhaps there are words, perhaps not. The first blow strikes Abby above the ear. She falls face down. Lizzie straddles her back. The rage, suppressed for years, the rage of a spinster trapped in a house of miserly control, the rage of a daughter who feels her inheritance slipping away to a stepmother, explodes. 19 times. Lizzie stands. She is covered in blood, but she is prepared. She is wearing the husband's old coat, or perhaps she is stripped naked, or down to her undergarments, knowing the blood would wash off skin easier than silk. This detail remains the eternal question mark. She washes. She waits. Andrew comes home early. This is the variable she didn't expect. The lock is jammed. Bridget has to let him in. Lizzie laughs from the top of the stairs, a chilling, misplaced sound. Andrew lies down. He is defenseless. Lizzie has a choice. She can stop. She can flee. But she cannot. Abby is dead upstairs. If Andrew wakes, he will find her. There is no turning back. The path is set. She descends. She approaches the sofa. She does not hesitate. She needs to destroy the face. If she destroys the face, she destroys the identity, the authority, the father. 11 blows. She washes again. She hides the hatchet head in the ashes of the cellar, mimicking the look of old metallurgy. She burns the handle in the stove. She dresses in the blue bengaline. She calls Bridget. The perfect crime is not one without clues. It is one with too many contradictory clues. It is a crime where the sheer audacity of the act shields the perpetrator. The jury could not hang Lizzie because they could not imagine her doing it. They were blinded by the bias of their era. Lizzie lived the rest of her life in Maplecroft, surrounded by her dogs and her squirrels. She travelled to Boston. She went to the theatre. She sued newspapers that slandered her. She lived with her sister Emma for years, until a sudden mysterious falling out in 1905 caused Emma to move out in the dead of night, never to speak to Lizzie again. What did Emma know? What did Emma finally admit to herself? Lizzie died in 1927. She took her secrets to the grave. But the house on 2nd Street remained. It stood as a monument to the unexplained. The bloodstains on the floorboards were scrubbed away, but the psychic stain remained. In the decades that followed, forensic science advanced. Luminol could have detected the washed blood. DNA could have typed the splatter. Fingerprint analysis could have identified the grip on the hatchet. But in 1892, these tools were dreams of the future. The Borden case became the locked room mystery of the millennium. It was analysed by lawyers, authors, and armchair detectives. Theories abounded. It was Bridget. It was an illegitimate son of Andrew. It was a lover of Lizzie's. It was an epileptic seizure state. Yet all roads eventually lead back to the girl in the blue dress. The silence of the house in those 5 minutes between Andrew's death and Bridget's wake-up call is the loudest silence in criminal history. In that silence, a transformation occurred. A daughter ceased to be a daughter and became a legend of American Gothic horror. Even now, walking past 92 2nd Street, one can almost feel the oppression of that August day. The heat, the smell of mutton, the flies buzzing against the screen, the heavy tread of boots on the stairs. And the question persists, whispering through the cracks of history. Not, quote, 71, for the answer seems etched in the very air, but, quote, 72. How did she walk between the raindrops of suspicion? How did she scrub the mark of Cain from her brow in mere moments? The answer lies in the blood itself. Forensic analysis of the crime scene photos suggests that the blood from Andrew's wounds sprayed primarily forward and to the side, onto the wall and the furniture. The attacker, standing above and slightly behind the head of the sofa, might have been in a, quote, 73, quote, of splatter. The physics of the swing, the arc of the hatchet, threw the gore away from the wielder. If Lizzie had covered her front with an apron, or even a newspaper, and if she had washed her face and hands in the kitchen sink immediately, Bridget testified the sink was dry, but water dries quickly in high heat, she could have presented a clean facade. The blue dress she burned? Alice Russell was right. It was likely the carrier of the microscopic evidence that would have convicted her. A single speck of blood, dismissed as, quote, 74, quote, was enough to send her to the gallows. By burning it, she burned the rope. The story of Lizzie Borden is not just a story of murder, it is a story of the Victorian mask. It is about what happens behind the closed doors of respectability. It is about the tension between the public face and the private rage. As the years ground on, Lizzie became a caricature. But in the immediate aftermath, in those long hours in the station house and the jail, she was a woman fighting for her life. She stared down the law and won. There is a final irony to the tale. Andrew Borden, a man who counted every penny, who lived in austerity despite his wealth, left an estate valued at over $300,000, millions in today's currency. Lizzie and Emma inherited it all. The murder bought Lizzie the freedom she had always been denied. It bought her a larger house, servants, and travel. It was a transaction, blood for liberty. But it was a liberty enjoyed in isolation. She died alone, save for her servants. At her funeral there were few mourners. She was buried in Oak Grove Cemetery, at the feet of the father she had slaughtered and the stepmother she had despised. The wind blows through the trees at Oak Grove, rustling the leaves over the Borden plot. The stone simply says, quote, 75, quote. It offers no defense, no apology, and no explanation. The timeline is closed, the witnesses are dust. The house is a museum where tourists sleep in the deathbeds, hoping for a shiver, a ghost, a sign. But the only sign is the enduring, unanswerable riddle of the girl who stood at the screen door, dry-eyed and calm, while the world around her turned red. The blood was there, somewhere. It had to be. Matter does not disappear. It was washed into the sewers of Fall River, or turned to ash in the kitchen stove, or perhaps, just perhaps, it was never there at all. A miracle of angles and luck that allowed a killer to walk away clean. We are left only with the rhyme, the heat, and the hatchet, and the eyes of Lizzie Borden, staring out from the sepia photographs, challenging us to prove what we know in our bones to be true. The house sat in silence, and in that silence, the legend began to breathe, inhaling the dust of the dead and exhaling the nightmare of a century. The investigation that day laid the groundwork for the century of forensics that would follow. The failures of the Fall River police, the lack of scene preservation, the contamination of evidence, the failure to secure the clothes, became textbook examples of how not to manage a crime scene. In a way, Lizzie Borden taught the world how to catch a killer by showing them exactly how one gets away. When night finally fell on August 4th, 1892, the temperature dropped only slightly. The air remained thick. In the police station, The evidence boxes sat on a desk, a handleless hatchet, a few samples of hair, a stomach in a jar. In the house on 2nd Street, the blood had been mopped up, the water buckets emptied, the physical traces were fading. But the psychological imprint was hardening like concrete. The quote 76 had ceased to be a local tragedy and had begun their metamorphosis into American mythology. Lizzie lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was hers. The money was hers. The future was hers. Did she sleep? Or did she listen to the creaking of the floorboards, the settling of the old wood, sounding like footsteps approaching from the guest room? We will never know. The door is locked. The curtains are drawn. The case is closed. Only the rhyme remains. Gave her mother 40 whacks. A gross exaggeration. It was 19. But in the calculus of horror, the difference is negligible. The intent was total obliteration. When she saw what she had done, did she see? Really see? Or was it a red haze, a fugue state of dissociation? She gave her father 41. 11. Efficient, brutal, final. The hatchet sits in a museum now, or a replica of it. The real one is likely rust and dust, returned to the earth. But the edge remains sharp in our collective memory, cutting through the years, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones under the bed, but the ones standing in the kitchen, eating a pear, waiting for the right moment to strike. Marshal Hilliard descended the cellar stairs, the wooden risers groaning under his weight. The air down here was cooler, smelling of coal dust, damp earth, and the faint, coppery tang that seemed to permeate the entire property. It was Monday, August 8th. The bodies were buried, but the house remained a crime scene in theory, though in practice it was a sieve of comings and goings. Hilliard was not looking for a ghost, he was looking for steel. He approached the chimney-piece in the washroom. On a shelf, cluttered with the detritus of household maintenance, lay a collection of tools, 2 hatchets and a claw-headed hammer. He bypassed the hammer and the first hatchet, which was rusted and dull, clearly unused for years. His hand closed around the second hatchet. It was heavy. The head was steel, but the handle was broken off short, leaving a jagged splinter of wood protruding from the eye. The metal was covered in a thick layer of coarse white ash. It looked like it had been dipped in a flour barrel, or perhaps rolled in the ashes of the coal furnace. Hilliard called out. Officer Mullally stepped forward, swinging the beam of light over the tool. Hilliard ran a thumb over the break in the wood. The fracture was bright, fresh. The wood inside the eye of the hatchet head was white and clean, contrasting sharply with the weathered, dusty exterior of the metal. Hilliard asked. Mullally replied. Hilliard lifted the head. He wrapped the hatchet head in a piece of paper. This was the first tangible anchor in a sea of speculation. The handleless hatchet. It became Exhibit C. It was a physical object that defied the narrative of an intruder. An intruder brings a weapon and takes it with them. A resident uses what is at hand and destroys it to hide it. The investigation moved from the cellar to the courtroom. The inquest began on August 9th, held in the stifling heat of the courtroom above the police station. District Attorney Knowlton presided, a man who viewed the law as a machine for extracting truth from reluctant awe. Lizzie Borden took the stand. She was not under arrest, not yet. She was a witness, but the mood in the room suggested otherwise. She wore a dark blue dress, her face composed, her hands resting in her lap. Knowlton wasted no time. He needed to pin down her location during the critical window, the 90 minutes between her father's return home and the alarm she raised. "Where were you when your father came in?" Knowlton asked. His voice was level, distinct. "I was in the dining room," Lizzie said. Her voice was low. The stenographer leaned in. "I was ironing some handkerchiefs." "And after he arrived?" "He sat down. I asked him if he had any mail. He said no. I told him I was going out to the barn to get some lead sinkers for a fishing trip." "Lead sinkers," Knowlton repeated. He wrote nothing down. "And you went to the barn?" "Yes." "How long were you there?" 20 minutes? Perhaps 30? Knowlton paused. He looked at his notes. The timeline was already fracturing. 30 minutes in a barn loft, on one of the hottest days of the year. Doing what, Miss Borden? Looking for sinkers, and eating a pear. You ate a pear in the loft. 3 pears, she corrected. I was eating pears. And the window? The barn window was closed. So you spent 30 minutes in a closed, unventilated barn loft in August, eating pears, while your father lay down for a nap? Yes. Knowlton stepped back. He let the silence hang. The logic was fraying. The barn had been searched by officers within an hour of the murder. The dust on the floor of the loft was thick and undisturbed. There were no footprints, no core of a pear, no sign of a human presence. And prior to that, Knowlton pressed, where were you when your mother, Mrs. Borden, was killed? We believe this was around 9:30. Lizzie stiffened slightly. I was downstairs, or perhaps I was upstairs. I thought I heard her come in. I thought she had gone out. You thought she had gone out? She received a note, Lizzie said. Someone was sick. She went to visit them. We have found no note, Knowlton said. We have found no sick friend. Did you see her leave? No. Did you see her return? No. So for 2 hours, you and the maid, Bridget, were in the house with your stepmother's body, and you heard nothing. No fall? No cry? I was in the barn, Lizzie said again, retreating to the one location that offered an alibi, however flimsy. Or I was in the yard. The inconsistency was not just in the details, it was in the fundamental architecture of her memory. Under Knowlton's drilling, Lizzie's story shifted. First she was in the kitchen, then the dining room. First she heard a groan, then she heard nothing. She claimed to be downstairs ironing, yet the flat irons on the stove were found cold. The investigation turned its gaze from her words to her wardrobe. Dr. Dolan, the medical examiner, led the inquiry into the physical evidence on Lizzie's person. If she had wielded a hatchet with sufficient force to crush 2 skulls, the laws of physics dictated a transfer of matter, blood, bone fragments, brain tissue. It should have sprayed backward, coating the assailant. Police demanded the dress she had worn on the morning of August 4th. Lizzie presented a dress of Bengaline silk. It was dark blue with a subtle figure. Marshal Hilliard asked Emma Borden. Emma replied. She stood between the police and her sister, a shield of Victorian propriety. Hilliard examined the fabric. It was clean, not just washed, but unstained. There was no smell of bleach, no stiff patches where blood might have been scrubbed out. He held it up to the window. Hilliard muttered to Dolan. Dolan suggested. Hilliard argued. They checked her shoes. Clean. They checked her petticoats. Clean. The forensic paradox was taking shape. The crime was incredibly bloody. The scene in the guest room where Abby Borden lay was a horror. Blood had splashed the wall, the bedspread, the mirror, yet the suspect was pristine. 2 theories emerged in the station house discussions. The first was the quote, that the killer had stripped naked to commit the crimes, then washed and dressed. In 1892, this was a concept so deviant, so psychologically jarring, that to utter it was almost as scandalous as the murder itself. It was quickly dismissed by the public, though the police kept it in the back of their minds. The second theory was the, quote, 123, quote. Reports came in from a neighbour, Alice Russell. She had stayed in the Borden house in the days following the murder to comfort the sisters. She testified to a disturbing scene in the kitchen on Sunday morning. She had walked in to find Lizzie standing by the stove, tearing at a dress. Lizzie had said, Alice Russell had warned her, but the dress went into the fire. Was it the Bengaline silk, or was it a different dress, a Bedford cord cotton dress that witnesses remembered her wearing on Thursday morning? The police had failed to secure the clothing immediately. They had been too polite, too deferential to the grieving daughter of a wealthy man. By the time they asked for the dress, Lizzie had had 3 days to choose which one to hand over. The ashes in the stove told no tales. The evidence was gone. The investigation moved to the perimeter. If Lizzie was not the killer had to be an outsider. This required an entry point. Marshal Hilliard returned to the house on 2nd Street to test the, quote, 127, quote. Andrew Borden was a man obsessed with security. His wealth was not displayed in tapestries or fine art, but in locks. Hilliard stood at the front door. "Quote," he said, addressing the maid who sat nervously on a chair in the hallway. Bridget Sullivan, her hands trembling, recounted the ritual. Hilliard moved to the side door. Hilliard tried the front door. It was heavy, solid oak. He threw the bolt. He turned the key. He engaged the bottom lock. It was a vault. Hilliard said, turning to his deputy. The deputy asked. Hilliard reasoned. Hilliard added, pointing to the lack of blood trails. The, quote, 147 theory was dissolving. There were reports, of course. A man sleeping in a hedge on 3rd Street, a pale man seen arguing with a carriage driver. But none of them placed a man inside the sealed envelope of the Borden house. The geometry of the crime scene was compressing. The walls were closing in on the inhabitants. The focus shifted to the physiology of death. The autopsies had been conducted on the dining room table on the day of the murder, a gruesome necessity in the heat of August. Now, the samples taken were subjected to rigorous analysis by Dr. William Dolan and the eminent medical expert from Harvard, Dr. Draper. They were looking for poison. The town was rife with rumors that the Bordens had been violently ill the previous Tuesday. Lizzie had reportedly tried to buy prussic acid from a local druggist on Wednesday, claiming it was for cleaning a sealskin cape. The druggist had refused her. Dr. Draper announced, looking up from his microscope. Dolan surmised. Draper said, adjusting the slide. He pulled the report closer. The science of gastric emptying was inexact in 1892, but the principles were understood. Digestion halts at the moment of death. The stomach becomes a biological clock, frozen in time. Draper began. He pointed to the first jar, labelled Andrew Borden. 157, Dolan said. Draper moved to the second jar, Abby Borden. Draper said, his voice dropping an octave. He looked at Dolan, removing his spectacles. Dolan did the mental calculation. Draper concluded. The room went silent. The implications were catastrophic for the defense. If Abby and Andrew had died at the same time, killed by a frenzy of blows from an intruder who surprised them both, the digestion would be identical. But if Abby died at 9:30, she lay dead in the guest room for a full 90 minutes, while Andrew Borden went to the bank, walked downtown, and returned home. For 90 minutes, the killer waited in the house. For 90 minutes, Lizzie Borden claimed to be downstairs, sewing and ironing, within 20 feet of her stepmother's corpse. She had told the police she thought her mother had, quote, 164, quote. She had told her father upon his return that Abby had received a note and left. But the stomach contents proved Abby never left. She was upstairs, cooling on the floor, while Lizzie greeted her father, offered him the sofa, and perhaps adjusted the blinds to keep the sun from his face. Draper wrote the final line of his report, the ink glistening on the page. Conclusion. The victim Abby Borden predeceased the victim Andrew Borden by approximately 90 minutes. Dolan stared at the sentence, the cursive loops of the Y and G trailing downward like roots, seeking purchase in the paper. It was a sentence that would hang a woman. He exhaled, a long, ragged sound that seemed too loud in the stillness of the makeshift laboratory. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of formaldehyde, stale tobacco, and the cloying, sweet rot of the summer heat that even the thick brick walls could not entirely keep at bay. Dolan repeated, testing the weight of the words on his tongue. It felt heavy, like a stone dropped into a deep well. Draper did not look up immediately. He was methodical, a man of Harvard, possessed of that icy New England reserve that Dolan, with his Irish blood and local roots, found both admirable and maddening. Draper was cleaning the nib of his pen with a small chamois cloth, treating the instrument with as much care as he had the scalpel. Draper said finally, his tone flat, brooking no argument. He gestured with the clean pen toward the grisly exhibits. Draper replaced the pen in its holder and stood, walking over to the window. He peered through the slats of the blinds, looking out at the dusty street where the heat waves shimmered off the cobblestones. Dolan stood up and walked to the table. He picked up the lid of the jar labelled Abbey Borden and twisted it shut. The grinding of the glass threads was a harsh, grating sound. He sealed the truth inside, Dolan said, picking up the jar and feeling its cold weight. He began to pace the small room, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. Draper turned from the window. Dolan continued. Draper supplied. Dolan said. He stopped pacing and looked at Draper. The horror of the calculation was beginning to take a physical shape in the room. Dolan whispered. Draper said. Dolan said, his voice rising slightly. Draper noted, moving back to the table to organize his slides. Dolan visualized the scene, his eyes squeezed shut. Draper scoffed softly. Dolan tapped the jar. Draper said. Dolan opened his eyes, looking at his colleague. Draper finished. The two men stood in silence for a long moment. The scientific deduction had transformed into a narrative of Gothic horror. The sterility of the lab fell away, replaced by the suffocating atmosphere of the Borden house at 92 2nd Street. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window seemed to swirl like the secrets of that dark, narrow hallway. Dolan said, breaking the spell. He placed his hand on the report. Draper said, practical as ever. Dolan repeated. They began the grim work of securing the evidence. Draper found a sturdy wooden crate in the corner of the room, originally used for shipping medical spirits. He lined the bottom with straw and wood shavings. With the reverence of priests handling holy relics, they lowered the jars into the box. Andrew Borden, Abbey Borden. The physical remnants of a tragedy reduced to chemistry. Dolan fetched a hammer and nails to seal the crate, but Draper stopped him with a raised hand. Dolan agreed. They gathered their coats. Despite the heat, propriety demanded the uniform of their profession. Dolan donned his bowler hat, checking his reflection in the glass of a cabinet. He looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights since the murders on August 4th. The whole city was sleepless. Fall River was a powder keg, and they were carrying the match. Draper locked the door to the examination room behind them, rattling the handle to be sure. They carried the crate between them, descending the narrow stairs to the street level. The heat hit them like a physical blow as they stepped out onto the sidewalk. It was a humid, oppressive warmth that stuck the shirt to the back and made the air feel thick enough to chew. The street was busy. Carts rattled over the stones, horses flicked their tails at flies, and men in shirt sleeves wiped their brows with handkerchiefs. To the passers-by, they were just two doctors carrying a box. Perhaps supplies, perhaps medicine. No one looked twice. No one knew that in that crate lay the condemnation of a Sunday school teacher, a member of the Fruit and Flower Mission, a daughter of the city's wealthy elite. Dolan hailed a passing hackney. The carriage pulled up, the horse snorting, its coat slick with sweat. The driver, a weathered man with a face like a dried apple, looked down at them. Dolan said, lifting the crate up to the floor of the cab before climbing in. The driver nodded, flicking the reins. The carriage lurched forward. Inside, the air was stifling. The smell of old leather and horsehair mixed with the lingering scent of formaldehyde clinging to their clothes. Draper sat with his hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. Draper said, his voice low, barely audible over the clatter of the wheels. Dolan said. Dolan agreed. Draper said. Dolan looked out the window. They were passing the mill district now. The great stone factories loomed over the street, the noise of the looms a distant, rhythmic thrumming like a mechanical heartbeat. Thousands of people working, sweating, living their lives. And in the midst of this industry, a quiet house on 2nd Street had become a slaughterhouse. Dolan said softly. Draper said. Dolan turned back to his colleague. The carriage slowed as they approached the city centre. The crowds were thicker here. Newsboys were shouting headlines. The Fall River Globe, the Herald. The murders were the only news that mattered. Rumours were flying faster than the telegraph wires could carry them. A Portuguese labourer had been arrested. A wild-eyed stranger seen in the woods. Poison in the milk. Dolan murmured, watching the crowd. Draper said. Dolan noted. Draper tapped the crate with his boot. The carriage halted in front of the brick building housing the district attorney's office. Dolan paid the driver, tipping him extra for the speed, though the man seemed more interested in eavesdropping than the coin. They hauled the crate out and marched up the steps. The office of Hosea Knowlton was a sanctuary of law, lined with books bound in calfskin, smelling of polish and pipe smoke. It was a world away from the blood and the bile of the examination room. Knowlton's secretary, a young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up, startled by their abrupt entrance. "Doctors," he stammered. "Mr. Knowlton is preparing for the afternoon session of the inquest. He is quite busy." "He will see us," Dolan said, his voice carrying the authority of the dead. "Tell him we have brought the clocks." The secretary blinked, confused. "The clocks?" "Just tell him," Dolan barked. Moments later, they were ushered into the inner sanctum. Hosea Knowlton sat behind a massive oak desk, a mountain of paperwork before him. He was a formidable man, with a heavy brow and eyes that had seen too much of the darker side of human nature, yet still retained a glimmer of weary idealism. He looked up, removing his spectacles. "Dolan? Draper?" Knowlton nodded. He looked at the crate they set down on his conference table. "I assume you haven't brought me a case of whiskey, much as I could use one right now." "Better," Draper said. "We have the answer, Hosea." Knowlton leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "The answer to what?" "To the sequence," Dolan said. "To the alibi." Draper stepped forward, opening the crate and lifting out the jars again. The liquid sloshed gently. Knowlton grimaced slightly but did not look away. "You asked us to determine if there was poison," Draper began. "There was none. The stomach linings were healthy, irritated only by the natural acids of digestion." "So, no poison," Knowlton sighed, rubbing his temples. "That weakens the prussic acid testimony. If she bought it, she didn't use it. The defense will argue she never intended to use it on her parents." "Forget the poison," Dolan interrupted. "Look at the food, Hosea." He pointed to the jars, repeating the lecture he had given in the lab, but with more urgency now. He explained the chyme, the starch, the meat fibers. He explained the physiology of the pyloric valve. He laid out the timeline. Breakfast at 7, Andrew's death at 11, confirmed by the advanced digestion. Knowlton asked, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. Draper said. Knowlton went still. He was a brilliant legal mind, and Dolan could see the gears turning, fitting this new cog into the machine of the case. Knowlton whispered. Dolan said. Knowlton stood up and walked to the window, much as Draper had done. He clasped his hands behind his back. Knowlton said, turning back to them. His face was hard now. Dolan said. Knowlton said, his voice deepening. Draper said, 6-7. Knowlton murmured, almost to himself. Dolan finished. Knowlton walked back to the desk and stared at the jars. He said. He stopped. Draper said gently. Knowlton nodded slowly. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen. He gestured to the jars. Dolan said, sensing the moment was right to add the psychological weight to the physical evidence. Ilton asked. Dolan said. Knowlton realized. Dolan said grimly. Knowlton shuddered. It was a rare reaction for the hardened prosecutor. Draper said. Knowlton said. He began to write. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room. Dolan and Draper stood like sentinels guarding the truth in the wooden crate. Dolan's mind drifted back to the house on 2nd Street. He imagined the scene again, the one the stomach contents had painted for them. 9:30 a.m., the first blow, the surprise. Abby Borden, a heavy woman, falling to her knees, then to her face. The camera of his mind zoomed in, the axe, or hatchet, swinging down, the sheer physical effort required. It was not a dainty act, it was butcher's work. Blood spray, bone fragments. 9:45 a.m. The killer stands over the body. Is she panting? Is her heart racing? Or is she calm? She must check her dress. Is there blood? She must wash. Where? The guest room water pitcher? No, that would leave pink water. The kitchen sink? She goes downstairs. 10 a.m. Bridget is outside washing windows. The house is hers. She walks through the dining room. She picks up a flat iron. She puts it on the stove. The mundane domesticity of it was the most terrifying part. To iron while the blood dried upstairs. 10:30 a.m. She hears the gate squeak. Is it him? No, just a passerby. She waits. 10:45 a.m. The lock rattles. Andrew is home. Dolan looked at the jar labelled Andrew Borden. The man had come home to his sanctuary, expecting cool water and a rest. He had found his doom. "Gentlemen," Knowlton said, putting down his pen, "I will need a formal report written up, detailed, every observation, every measurement. I want it ready for the grand jury." "You shall have it," Draper said. "And keep this quiet," Knowlton warned, his eyes darting to the door. "If the press gets hold of the 90-minute gap before we present it, they will spin it. They will find a way to explain it away. We must ambush the defense with this." "We understand," Dolan said. They picked up the crate. It felt heavier now, as if the gravity of the impending arrest had added physical mass to the glass and fluid. Leaving the office, the afternoon sun had moved lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the street. The mood in the city had shifted. The workers were beginning to spill out of the mills, a tide of grey and denim. The conversation on every corner was the same. Lizzie, Lizzie, Lizzie. Asterisk, 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 asterisk 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 asterisk, 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 asterisk. They walked back toward the medical examiner's office, the box between them. "You know," Draper said quietly, breaking the silence of their walk, "there is a tragedy in the biology beyond the murder." "How so?" Dolan asked. "Andrew's stomach. The digestion was good. He was healthy. A man of 70 years, but his constitution was strong. He could have lived another 10, 15 years. And Abby?" "The same. Stout, yes, but vital." Draper shook his head. "We spend our lives studying how the body fails. Disease, age, infirmity. We fight to keep the clock ticking. And then someone comes along and simply smashes the clock." "It wasn't just smashing the clock," Dolan corrected him. "It was winding it back. She tried to rewrite history. She tried to make us believe in a timeline that didn't exist." "But the stomach remembers," Draper said. "The stomach always remembers." They reached their building. The sanctuary of science awaited them. They would have to store the samples in the coolest part of the cellar. They would have to write the report that would send a woman to trial for her life. As they entered the cool darkness of the hallway, leaving the blinding sun behind, Dolan felt a strange sense of finality. The mystery of who might still be debated by the public, by the newspapers, by the poets and the gossips. But for him, and for Draper, the mystery of when was solved. And in a murder investigation, when was the key that unlocked the door to who. The 90 minutes were no longer empty time. They were filled with the silent, invisible presence of the killer, waiting in the dark hallway, hatchet in hand, listening for the turn of the key. Dolan set the crate down on the laboratory table. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He was ready for the fight to come. "Start the draft, Draper," Dolan said, taking off his hat and hanging it on the peg. "I'll light the lamps. It's going to be a long night." Draper pulled a fresh sheaf of paper toward him, the nib of his pen hovering over the blank white expanse. "Report on the autopsy of Abby Durfee Borden and Andrew Jackson Borden," he wrote. "Supplemental findings regarding gastric digestion and time of death." The ink flowed black and permanent. The story of the 90 minutes was now written in stone. George Robinson stood in the center of the stifling New Bedford courtroom and held the rusted head of a hatchet up to the light. It was a piece of iron, pitted and scarred, detached from any handle. He turned it slowly, letting the jury see the coarse fractures in the metal. "Gentlemen," Robinson said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated against the wooden paneling. "Look at this. The Commonwealth asks you to believe this is the instrument of death. They ask you to believe that a woman of gentle breeding wielded this clumsy scrap of iron to butcher her father and stepmother. But look closely." He walked to the jury box, leaning over the rail. "Where is the handle?" District Attorney Knowlton sat at the prosecution table, his jaw set in a hard line. He knew what was coming. The police had found the head in a box of old iron in the cellar, covered in ashes. They had assumed the handle was broken off and burned. It was a logical assumption, but in a court of law, logic without wood was merely speculation. "They say she burned the handle," Robinson continued, tossing the heavy iron head onto the evidence table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that made the foreman flinch. "Just as they say she burned the dress, just as they say she washed the blood from her hair, from her skin, from the very walls of the house. They present you with a crime of phantom evidence, a phantom handle, a phantom bloodstain, and they ask you to hang a flesh and blood woman based on things you cannot see." Lizzie Borden sat behind her counsel, her face a mask of porcelain stillness. She held a fan in her lap, her fingers laced together, motionless. She stared at the back of Robinson's coat. She did not look at the hatchet head. She did not look at the jury. She embodied the Victorian ideal of composure, a statue carved from ice in the sweltering June heat. The defense strategy was not subtle. It was a siege against the physical reality of the crime scene. If the police could not produce the bloody handle, there was no weapon. If they could not produce the bloody dress, there was no killer. Knowlton stood up. "The Commonwealth calls Alice Russell." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew heavier. Alice Russell was Lizzie's friend. She was the betrayal sitting in the front row. As she took the stand, her face was blotched and red, her eyes darting nervously toward Lizzie, who refused to meet her gaze. "Miss Russell," Knowlton began, pacing the floor, "I want you to take your mind back to the Sunday morning following the murders. August the 7th. You were in the Borden kitchen?" "Yes, sir," Alice whispered. "Speak up, please. Who else was there?" "Lizzie was there, and Emma." "And what was Lizzie doing?" Alice gripped the railing of the witness stand. "She was standing by the stove. She had a dress, a Bedford cord dress, blue." "And what was the condition of this dress?" "It had paint on it," Alice said quickly, reciting the line she had told herself 1,000 times. She said she had got paint on it in May. "Paint," Knowlton repeated, letting the word hang in the humid air. He turned to the jury. "Paint. Not blood. Paint." He spun back to the witness. "What did she do with the dress, Miss Russell?" Alice closed her eyes. "She tore it. She tore a loose piece from the skirt. And then? She put it in the fire." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judges tapped their gavels, but the noise persisted. The image was domestic and terrifying. The daughter of the house, 3 days after the slaughter, feeding a blue dress into the coal fire of the kitchen stove, while the police stood guard outside the front door. "Did you say anything to her?" Knowlton asked. "I said—" Alice's voice broke. She cleared her throat. "I said, I wouldn't let anybody see me do that, Lizzie." "Why did you say that?" "Because," Alice said, her voice trembling, "I knew how it would look." "Yes," Knowlton said softly. "We all know how it looks." He sat down. Robinson waived the cross-examination. He knew better than to keep the image of the burning dress in the jury's mind for a second longer than necessary. He relied on the gap in the logic. Alice saw paint, or was told it was paint. No one saw blood. The fire had consumed the truth, leaving only ash. The trial moved from the kitchen to the laboratory. The fight for Lizzie Borden's life became a fight over the digestion of breakfast. Dr. William Dolan took the stand. He looked tired. The months since the autopsy had aged him. The weight of the stomach jars in the cellar of the dedicated medical examiner's building had pressed down on his conscience. He was a man of science in a room governed by rhetoric. Knowlton led him through the grim preliminaries, the wounds, the skulls, the force required. Then they reached the timeline. Dolan said. His voice was clinical, detached. Knowlton repeated. This was the pivot point of the prosecution. If Abby died 90 minutes before Andrew, while Andrew was downtown at the bank, then the killer had to be someone who could wait. Someone who could kill the stepmother in the guest room, clean the hatchet, wait in the house for an hour and a half, greet the father when he came home, and then kill him on the sofa. A stranger would not wait. A burglar would have fled. Only a resident could wait. Robinson rose for the cross-examination. He did not attack Dolan's science directly. He attacked the certainty of the biological machine. Robinson began, smoothing his lapels. Throwland conceded. The Robinsons stepped closer. Dolan hesitated. Dolan admitted. Robinson boomed. Robinson pointed a finger at the doctor. Dolan stiffened. Robinson scoffed. From the defense table, Lizzie watched. The argument about stomach acid and chyme seemed distant to her. She was thinking about the barn. She had told the police she was in the barn for 20 minutes, looking for lead sinkers for a fishing line. The police found no footprints in the dust of the barn loft. They said the dust was undisturbed. But Robinson had handled that too. He had produced witnesses who said ice cream peddlers had walked through the barn, implying the police had simply missed the signs. He was dismantling the timeline brick by brick, using doubt as his mortar. The psychological profile of the killer was never officially entered into evidence. In 1893, the terms, quote, 366, quote, or, quote, 367, quote, were not in the vocabulary of the Fall River jury. But the shadow of the psychology hung over the courtroom. To the 12 men in the jury box, farmers and tradesmen with calloused hands, the profile of the killer presented by the prosecution was a psychological impossibility. They looked at Lizzie, with her trembling chin and her Sunday school record. They tried to imagine her swinging a hatchet into her father's face, 11 times. It required a fracture in the mind that they could not comprehend. However, a modern eye, looking back through the lens of forensic psychology, sees the clarity that the jury missed. The crime was not a burst of passion, it was a bifurcated event. The murder of Abby Borden was the primary objective. It was personal. The blows were focused on the head, 19 of them. It was an annihilation of identity. The killer had attacked her from the front, then continued as she fell. This was rage. This was the result of years of simmering resentment over property, over lineage, over the feeling of displacement in her own home. But the second murder, the murder of Andrew, was different. It was necessary. If Lizzie had killed Abby and let Andrew live, she would have been disinherited. Andrew would have known. He would have seen the hatred in the house. To secure the future, the patriarch had to fall. The 90 minutes between the deaths were not empty time. They were the most chilling aspect of the profile. A disorganized killer, a maniac, would have run. A thief would have taken the watch and fled. Lizzie Borden stayed. She had 90 minutes to wash the handleless hatchet, 90 minutes to check her dress, 90 minutes to compose herself. When Andrew came home, the door was locked. Bridget let him in. Lizzie laughed from the top of the stairs, a detail Bridget had mentioned in the preliminary hearings, but which had been softened for the trial. That laugh was the key. It was the laugh of someone in total control. The quote 368 theory, often cited by apologists, holds no water against the timeline. A person in a fugue state does not seamlessly transition from butchery to domestic conversation, discuss the mail, offer a plausible excuse for the stepmother's absence. She had a note from a sick friend, and then execute the second victim with such precision. This was a high-functioning sociopathic break. The ability to compartmentalize the violence was absolute. She could butcher the stepmother, then speak to the maid about lunch. She could butcher the father, then send the maid for the doctor. But Robinson was not arguing psychology, he was arguing sociology. "Look at her," Robinson implored the jury during his closing statement. He gestured to Lizzie, who lowered her eyes on cue. "To find her guilty, you must believe she is a fiend. You must believe that this woman, raised in the church, a daughter of Fall River, possesses a heart blacker than any criminal recorded in the annals of history. You must believe she has no soul." He paused, letting the silence stretch. The prosecution brings you a hatchet with no handle. They bring you a dress that was burned days later. They bring you stomach contents that are subject to the whims of digestion. They bring you everything except the one thing that matters: blood. Where is the blood? If she struck these blows, she would be bathed in it. And yet, she was spotless. This was the masterstroke, the lack of blood defense. Modern forensics suggest she may have committed the crimes naked or wearing one of Andrew's large coats, or that the spray was simply directional and she was lucky. But in 1893, the idea of a woman stripping naked to kill her parents was so obscene, so pornographic, that the prosecution dared not suggest it, and the defense knew the jury would never imagine it. The prosecution was trapped by the Victorian morality they sought to defend. To convict her, they had to describe a monster they were not permitted to name. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 8 minutes. The brevity was the first sign. A long deliberation means conflict, debate, a struggle over the evidence. A short deliberation means consensus. On June 20th, 1893, the courtroom was packed to the rafters. The heat was suffocating. Fans fluttered like the wings of 1,000 anxious moths. Lizzie Borden stood. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together. The clerk of the court, a man named Leonard, looked at the foreman. "Mr. Foreman, have you agreed upon a verdict?" "We have." "Lizzie Andrew Borden," the clerk intoned. "Stand up." She rose. She gripped the rail. For the first time, her composure seemed to fracture. Her knees shook. "Jurors, look upon the prisoner. Prisoner, look upon the jury. What say you, Mr. Foreman?" The foreman, a heavy-set man named Richards, cleared his throat. He looked directly at the judge, avoiding the eyes of the prosecutor. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. It was not a cheer of justice served, it was a release of tension, a collective exhale of a society that could not bear the thought of executing a woman of status. Men shouted, women wept. Lizzie sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands, sobbing dry, shaking sobs. Whether they were tears of relief or the final performance of the day, only she knew. Outside, the telegraph wires began to hum. The news flashed to Boston, to New York, to Chicago. Lizzie Borden acquitted. But inside the bar, Dr. Dolan packed his bag slowly. He watched the celebration with a cold, detached eye. He looked at the evidence table, now being cleared. The handleless hatchet was swept into a bag. The jars of stomach contents would be disposed of. The photographs of the skulls would be filed away in the damp archives of the courthouse basement. He met Knowlton's eyes across the room. The prosecutor looked defeated, not by the law, but by the limitations of their reality. They had the timeline. They had the digestion. They had the exclusion of all other suspects. But they did not have the imagination of the jury. Robinson was shaking hands, beaming, the victor of the century. He had saved a life, and in doing so he had buried the truth. As Lizzie was led out of the side door, away from the crush of the press, she walked with a steady gait. The frailty of the defendant had vanished. She was once again the mistress of her own destiny. She would return to the house on 2nd Street. She would inherit the money. She would live out her days in the high solitude of Maplecroft, the mansion on the hill she would soon buy. But the forensic questions did not end with the gavel. They simply went dormant. The timeline established by the stomach contents remained the single most damning piece of objective truth. Abby died first. Andrew died later. The killer waited. The digestion of the mutton told a story that no lawyer could argue away, even if a jury chose to ignore it. The biological clock had been smashed, but the pieces still pointed to the same time. Lizzie stepped into the carriage that waited to take her home. The crowd cheered. She did not wave. She sat back in the leather seat, the shadow of the carriage concealing her face. The mystery of how she was acquitted was solved. A lack of blood, a handleless weapon, and a jury's refusal to see the darkness in a woman. But the mystery of the 90 minutes, the silence in the hallway, the waiting, the cold calculation, remained. The verdict was legal, it was final. But in the eyes of the forensic timeline, the file would never be closed. The ghosts of Abby and Andrew Borden, suspended in the chemical reality of their own digestion, continued to point a spectral finger at the woman in the carriage. The carriage lurched forward. The wheels clattered over the cobblestones. Lizzie Borden rode away into history, leaving the truth locked in the stomach of the dead. The city of New Bedford fell away behind them, a backdrop of grey stone and salt air that had held her captive for 13 days of trial and 10 months of incarceration. The carriage was a hermetically sealed box of leather and velvet, smelling faintly of horsehair, and the stale lavender water Emma had dabbed onto her handkerchief hours ago. Inside this moving confessional, there was no priest, only a sister whose face was a map of exhausted relief and hidden terror. Emma sat opposite her, knees pressed together, gloved hands clutching a small black purse as if it contained the last remnants of their family's dignity. She looked at Lizzie, then looked away, her gaze fluttering to the passing window, where the blurred faces of the curious flashed by like lantern slides. "It is over, Lizzie," Emma whispered, the words sounding foreign in the thick silence. "It is finally over." Lizzie did not answer immediately. She was watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight that pierced the carriage curtains. Her mind was not on the acquittal, nor on the roar of the crowd that had greeted the verdict. Her mind was a precise instrument, recalibrating to the frequency of freedom. She felt the vibration of the wheels in her spine, a rhythmic thrumming that replaced the rigid schedule of the Taunton jail. "It is not over, Emma," Lizzie said finally, her voice possessing that peculiar, flat timbre that had so unsettled the matrons at the prison. "It is merely changing shape. The law has spoken, but the town has not finished with us." "They cheered for you," Emma insisted, her voice trembling. "Did you not hear them? The whole courtroom, the streets, they believe in you." "They cheer for a show," Lizzie corrected. "They cheer because the monster turned out to be a lady in a silk dress, and that makes them feel safe. But wait until the curtain falls. Wait until we are back on 2nd Street and the silence sets in. The carriage rattled over the bridge, crossing the Taunton River, moving from the site of judgment back to the site of the crime. The journey was long, a slow transition from the extraordinary theatre of the court to the mundane horror of the home. As the miles accumulated, the air seemed to grow heavier, laden with the humidity of early summer and the invisible weight of the past year. Lizzie closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she did not see the jury. She saw the timeline Dr. Dolan had tried so hard to weave into a noose. She saw the mutton broth. She saw the pears. She saw the digestion that had stopped, freezing time in the biological machinery of her father and stepmother. The stomach contents had been the only honest witnesses, and they had been ignored because they spoke a language the jury found too grotesque to translate into guilt. She felt a strange, cold kinship with those jars of evidence. They held the truth, suspended in alcohol, just as she held her own truth, suspended in an impenetrable calm. The carriage slowed as it entered Fall River. The atmosphere shifted. Here the cheering was more sporadic, intermingled with a hushed, vibrating tension. The mill workers were leaving their shifts, their faces coated in cotton dust, looking like ghosts in the fading light. They paused to watch the black carriage pass. They knew who was inside, the Sphinx of the Borden house. Turning onto 2nd Street felt like entering a canyon. The narrow thoroughfare was choked with humanity. A sea of boaters and bonnets bobbed in the street. Boys climbed the fences. Women leaned out of 2nd-story windows. The police had to clear a path, their horses nervous and skittish in the press of bodies. "Keep your head up," Lizzie murmured, more to herself than to Emma. The carriage halted in front of number 92. The house stood exactly as it had on that blistering day in August. The drab paint, the shuttered windows, the utter lack of architectural imagination. It was a box built for frugality, not comfort. It was a house that hoarded heat and secrets with equal greed. The door of the carriage opened. The noise of the crowd washed over them, a physical wave of sound. "Lizzie! Lizzie!" It was a chant, a celebration, but underneath it lay the hungry growl of the mob. They wanted to see her. They wanted to see the face that had looked upon the hatchet, or hadn't. Lizzie stepped down. She did not stumble. She moved with the fluid grace of a woman who has walked through fire and found she does not burn. She ignored the hands reaching out to touch her skirt. She ignored the reporters shouting questions about her plans, about the old house, about the ghosts. She walked up the steps, the screen door, the heavy inner door. Emma fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so violently she dropped them. The metal clattered on the wood, a sound like a gunshot in the sudden lull of the crowd near the porch. Lizzie bent down, picked them up, and unlocked the door herself. She turned the knob. The air inside the house rushed out to meet them. It was stagnant, smelling of old carpet, furniture polish, and the faint, unmistakable scent of a house that has been closed up against the world. But beneath that, or perhaps only in Lizzie's memory, was the metallic tang of iron and the sweetness of pear. They stepped inside. Lizzie closed the door and threw the bolt. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The roar of the crowd was muffled to a dull roar, like the ocean heard from inside a shell. They stood in the entry hall. To the left, the parlour. To the right, the sitting room. The sitting room. Lizzie's eyes went to the sofa. It was the same horsehair sofa. The police had returned it after their examinations, after the blood had been cleaned, after the cushions had been inspected. It sat there, black and unyielding. This was where Andrew Borden had been napping. This was where his face had been obliterated while he slept. Emma let out a small, strangled sob and hurried toward the kitchen, unable to look. She fled to the back of the house, to the familiar domesticity of the stove and the sink, away from the scene of the slaughter. Lizzie remained. She walked slowly into the sitting room. She removed her hat, the pins sliding out of her hair with ease. She placed the hat on the side table. She stood in the centre of the rug and looked at the spot where her father's head had rested. The light in the room was dim, filtered through the shutters. It was grey and joyless. Dr. Dolan was right, she thought. The timeline was the key. He knew it. She knew it. The 90 minutes between Abby's death upstairs and Andrew's death down here. 90 minutes of waiting in this house. 90 minutes of silence while the blood congealed in the guest room above. She walked to the mantel and ran a gloved finger along the edge. Dust. The maid, Bridget, was gone, having left the house and the service of the family, terrified and broken by the inquest. The house was dirty. It would need to be cleaned. Lizzie looked up at the ceiling. Directly above her was the guest room. The heavy footsteps of the police were gone, but the floorboards still creaked with memory. She imagined the layout of the bodies as if looking at a blueprint. Abby, face down between the bed and the bureau. Andrew slumped on the sofa. "I am home," she whispered to the empty room. 3 miles away, in the dim gaslight of a private room at the Union Club, District Attorney Knowlton poured a glass of amber liquid that caught the light like preserved amber. He did not drink immediately. He swirled the glass, watching the vortex. Dr. Dolan sat opposite him, his posture slumped. The medical examiner looked 10 years older than he had when he first arrived at 2nd Street with his black bag. "The jury verdict is an acquittal," Knowlton said, his voice raspy from days of oration. "But the medical verdict remains." "The digestion," Dolan muttered, staring at the tablecloth. "I cannot reconcile it, Hosea. I wake up at night thinking about it. The stomach contents of Mrs. Borden showed digestion had proceeded 3 to 4 hours. Mr. Borden's showed perhaps an hour. She died first. We proved it. We proved it with the absolute certainty of physiology." "And yet," Knowlton sighed, taking a drink, "Robinson made them see a grieving daughter. He made them see a Sunday school teacher. He made them look at the lack of blood on her dress and forget the apron she burned. He made them forget the bucket in the cellar." "The time gap is the killer," Dolan said, his finger tracing a pattern on the table. "Whoever killed Abby waited. They waited in that house for an hour and a half, with a dead body upstairs. They didn't flee. They didn't panic. They waited for Andrew to come home. That is not the act of a wandering maniac. That is not the act of a Portuguese labourer holding a grudge. That is the act of someone who lives there. Someone who could walk past the body, go downstairs, perhaps iron a handkerchief, perhaps read a magazine, and wait for the second act." Knowlton nodded grimly. Cold blood, ice water in the veins. To kill the stepmother, then wait for the father, to listen for his key in the lock, to greet him, to let him lie down. "It requires a dissociation of the mind that I cannot fathom," Dolan said, and the jury could not fathom it either. Therefore, they decided it was impossible, because if it were possible, if a woman like Lizzie Borden could do that, then no one is safe. No father is safe in his own home. It was easier for them to believe in a phantom intruder than to believe in the reality of that hatchet. "She is back there now," Knowlton said, looking out the window toward the darkening streets. "Sitting in those rooms." "God help her sister," Dolan said. Night settled over 92 2nd Street. The crowd had finally dispersed, driven away by the boredom of a closed door and the eventual setting of the sun. The gas lamps flickered to life in the parlour, casting long, wavering shadows against the floral wallpaper. Lizzie and Emma sat at the small dining table. The meal was cold, leftovers brought by a neighbour, accepted at the door by Emma with hurried thanks. They ate in silence. The sound of silverware scraping against china was deafening. "We must go away for a while," Emma said, breaking the silence. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "To the shore, or to Newport, somewhere away from this heat." Lizzie cut a piece of bread with precise, deliberate movements. "No, we stay. If we leave, it looks like flight. We have been vindicated, Emma. We have the right to live in our father's house." "But the memories, Lizzie, can you not feel them?" Lizzie chewed slowly, swallowed, and dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "Memories are just thoughts, Emma. They cannot hurt you. The dead are dead. We are rich now. We are independent women. We can do whatever we wish." "I don't feel rich," Emma whispered. "I feel watched." "Let them watch," Lizzie said, her eyes hard and bright. "They will see nothing. They saw nothing for 10 months, and they will see nothing for the rest of our lives." She stood up, the chair scraping harsh against the floorboards. "I am going to bed. I will take the guest room tonight." Emma dropped her fork. It clattered onto the plate. The guest room? Lizzie, you cannot. That is where Abby." "It is the largest room," Lizzie said calmly. "It has the best airflow. The other rooms are stifling. Why should I be afraid of a room? Abby is not there. She is in the cemetery, waiting for a stone." "Lizzie, please," Emma begged, shrinking back in her chair. "Sleep in your old room." "My old room is a prison cell," Lizzie said. "I am done with cells." She turned and walked out of the dining room, moving through the sitting room, past the sofa, to the narrow, steep staircase that wound up to the second floor. She climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister. At the top of the landing, she paused. To her right was her old room. To her left, the guest room. The door was ajar. Lizzie pushed the door open. The room had been scrubbed. The carpet where the body had lain was clean, though a faint discoloration remained if one knew where to look, a shadow within the weave. The bed was made, the sheets taut and white. The bureau stood against the wall, the mirror reflecting the emptiness of the room. She walked in. She did not sense a ghost. She did not feel a spectral finger pointing at her. She felt only ownership. She lit the gas lamp on the wall. The hiss of the gas was a comfort. She began to undress, removing the heavy silk dress she had worn for her triumph. She hung it in the wardrobe. She washed her face in the basin, staring at her reflection in the mirror, the same mirror that must have reflected the back of Abby's head a moment before the first blow. Lizzie looked into her own eyes. They were pale, unreadable. They were the eyes of a woman who had erased a problem and survived the consequences. She put on her nightgown and turned down the bed. She lay down in the very room where the tragedy had begun. She pulled the sheet up to her chin. Outside, the city of Fall River slept, or tried to. In the bars and the mills, men argued about the verdict. In the parsonages, ministers prayed for the soul of the city. In the laboratory of the medical examiner, the jars of evidence sat on shelves, the chemical processes halted, the truth preserved in formaldehyde. But in the guest room on 2nd Street, Lizzie Borden closed her eyes. She did not dream of hatchets. She did not dream of blood. She dreamed of a house on a hill, a house with high hedges and wide porches, far away from the mills, far away from the staring eyes, a house called Maplecroft. She breathed in the stillness of the room, the 90 minutes of silence now stretching into an eternity of quiet, and then she slept. The weeks that followed the acquittal were a slow attrition of the soul. The euphoria of the verdict evaporated like morning mist, revealing the hard, jagged landscape of reality. The friends who had supported Lizzie during the trial, the church ladies, the suffragettes who saw her as a victim of a patriarchal court, the wealthy matrons who could not conceive of a gentlewoman committing such butchery, began to drift away. It started with small things, a failure to catch her eye on the street, a sudden crossing to the other sidewalk, the invitations to tea that stopped arriving, the hush that fell over the congregation at the Central Congregational Church when Lizzie and Emma entered their pew. Lizzie noticed it all. She catalogued every snub, every averted gaze, with the same cold detachment she had shown in the courtroom. She did not weep. She did not rage. She simply hardened. One sweltering afternoon in July, Lizzie stood in the backyard of the 2nd Street house. The pear trees were heavy with fruit, the same trees whose bounty she had been picking on the morning of the murders, or so she had told the police. She reached up and plucked a pear. It was warm from the sun, the skin rough against her palm. She took a bite. The juice was sweet, cloying. "Lizzie?" She turned. Emma stood at the back door, looking anxious. "Mr. Jennings is here," Emma said. "He has brought the final accounting of the estate." Lizzie threw the half-eaten pear into the grass. The wasps began to circle it immediately. "Send him into the parlour." Andrew Jennings, the loyal defence attorney who had fought for her life, looked uncomfortable sitting on the velvet chair in the parlour. The room was dark, the shutters drawn against the heat. "Miss Borden," he said, rising as she entered. "Miss Emma." "Sit down, Mr. Jennings," Lizzie said, taking her father's chair. She did not hesitate to occupy the seat of authority now. "The probate is settled," Jennings said, opening his briefcase. "With the acquittal, there is no legal impediment to the inheritance. The estate is substantial. The mill stocks, the rental properties, the savings. It is very significant." He slid a paper across the table. The figure written there was enough to buy the entirety of 2nd Street 3 times over. It was a fortune that Andrew Borden had hoarded, pinched, and scraped together over a lifetime of miserliness. A fortune he had refused to spend on plumbing, or electricity, or a decent dress for his daughters. "It is ours?" Lizzie asked, her voice devoid of greed, merely seeking confirmation of fact. "It is yours and Miss Emma's, to share equally," Jennings said. He paused, clearing his throat. "However, I must speak candidly as your counsel and your friend." "Speak," Lizzie said. "The mood in the town has turned," Jennings said quietly. "The acquittal was a legal victory, but it has not been a social one. There are rumours. People talk. They analyse the testimony now that the emotion has faded. They ask about the note Mrs. Borden supposedly received. They ask why no one ever found the messenger. They ask about the hatchet." "Let them ask," Lizzie said. "It is becoming difficult," Jennings pressed, "for you to live here, in this house, in this town." "This is my town," Lizzie said. "My father helped build it. I will not be driven out by gossip." "No one is suggesting you leave Fall River," Jennings said, "but perhaps a change of residence. This house, it has a history now, a dark history. It attracts the wrong kind of attention." Lizzie looked around the parlour. She looked at the walls that had enclosed her life for 33 years, the walls that had suffocated her, the walls she had finally breached. "Yes," she said slowly, "this house is too small. We require something more suitable to our station, something on the hill." Emma gasped softly. "The hill? Lizzie, father would never—" "Father is dead," Lizzie cut in, her voice sharp. "We are the Bordens now, and we will live where we choose." The move to Maplecroft happened in the autumn, when the leaves were turning the colour of dried blood. The mansion was everything the 2nd Street house was not: expansive, ornate, situated high above the grime of the mills. It had bathrooms with running water. It had gaslights in every room. It had a porch that wrapped around the exterior like an embrace. Lizzie bought it with cash. She renamed herself Lisbeth. She ordered new furniture, expensive carriages, and hired a staff of servants. She tried to construct a new life, a life of culture and refinement, the life she had always felt she deserved. But the isolation followed her up the hill. The high society of Fall River, the families who lived in the other mansions on French Street, did not call. The doors remained closed. The social registry remained barred. Lizzie Borden had been acquitted of murder, but she had been convicted of being something perhaps even more terrifying to the Victorian mind: a woman who had destroyed the patriarch and profited from it. She sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the river. She could see the smokestacks of the mills her father had owned. She could hear the faint whistle of the trains. Inside the house, Emma was becoming a ghost of her own. She spent her days in her room, reading the Bible, growing more and more fearful of her sister. The silence between them, which had been a bond of survival during the trial, had curdled into a wall of suspicion. Emma knew the timeline too. Emma knew the layout of the house. Emma had been away in Fairhaven that day, but she had lived in the Borden house long enough to know its rhythms. She knew that no intruder could have entered, killed, waited 90 minutes, killed again, and left without leaving a trace. One evening, deep in winter, Dr. Dolan passed by Maplecroft in his carriage. He looked up at the lighted windows of the great house. Snow was falling, blanketing the city in white, softening the edges of the world. He thought of the hatchet head he had examined, the break in the handle, the way it had been covered in ashes to hide the blood, or so the theory went. He thought of the skulls, now stored in the archives. He saw a figure in the window of the library, a silhouette against the gaslight. It was Lizzie. She was standing motionless, looking out at the snow. Dolan shivered, though he was wrapped in furs. The law had failed. The science had been ignored. But the truth was a persistent thing. It lived in the stomach contents of the dead, and it lived in the solitude of the living. Lizzie watched the carriage pass. She did not know it was Dolan. She did not care. She turned back to the room. It was warm. It was beautiful. It was hers. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a volume of poetry. She sat in a velvet chair, adjusting the skirts of her expensive gown. She opened the book, but she did not read. She listened. She listened to the silence of the big house. It was different from the silence of 2nd Street. It was spacious. It was expensive, but it was still silence. And in the quiet, she could almost hear the ticking of a clock. Not the clock on the mantel, but the biological clock of a digestion that had ended on a hot August morning. Abby died first. Andrew died later. The killer waited. Lizzie smiled a small, tight smile. She turned the page. The past was a closed book, she told herself, but she knew, in the deep, cold recesses of her heart, that the book was not closed. The ink was still wet. The story was still being written, day by lonely day, in the high solitude of the mansion built on blood. She rang the bell for the maid. She wanted tea, and perhaps a pear. The carriage of history had driven her away from the crime, but she had brought the passenger with her. The mystery was not who killed the Bordens. The mystery was how one lived with the knowledge of the 90 minutes, how one sat in a parlour, ironed a handkerchief, and waited for the latch to click. Lizzie Borden took a sip of her tea when it arrived. It was hot. It washed away the taste of the past. She looked at her hands. They were soft, manicured, free of calluses. They were the hands of a lady. "It is a quiet night," she said to the empty room. The house creaked in the wind. The snow fell, and the timeline remained, etched in the chemical reality of the universe, pointing its spectral finger at the woman who sat alone in the light, mistress of her destiny, prisoner of her triumph.